So let me tell you a little bit about this handsome gentleman whose picture should be coming up. This is John Harold Johnson. He was from Chicago. His family was actually from the South. They moved to Chicago as part of the Great Migration. In 1942, Johnson worked for an insurance company based in Chicago. It was the Supreme Life Insurance Company of America, and Johnson was a clerk, which means he had access to a lot of the customer client information, the addresses, and maybe some demographic information. He did something genius as a clerk for an insurance company. He took these, he was able to sort the data and figure out which of the clients of the insurance company were African American. He got his mother to borrow some money. She borrowed $500, and she used some furniture that the family had as security for a $500 loan. And I'm going to come back to this idea of borrowing money secured by stuff, because it plays an important role towards the end of our story. But so Johnson's mom put up some furniture that she had. He got a $500 loan. With that $500, what he did is he did a mailing, and he sent these postcards, these subscription postcards, to basically to everybody in his mailing list that he thought was African American. And the postcard that he sent, it offered an annual subscription. It was $2 for an annual subscription to a magazine that did not yet exist. It was a magazine called Negro Digest. And here's a picture of the Negro Digest magazine. It was modeled off of like a Reader's Digest magazine, but obviously with a key difference in that it would show black faces and tell black stories. So he did this massive mailing in 1942. Within 2 months, he had received 3,000 of these postcards back with $2 checks or commitments to bill people who wanted to subscribe to this magazine. With the money he got from that, he printed his first publication, and that was Negro Digest, which was first published in 1942. By 6 months later, in the next year, the circulation of Negro Digest had grown from the 3,000 postcards he got back to 50,000 copies. In 1945, Johnson launched what became Johnson Publishing Company's flagship magazine, and that is, of course, Ebony magazine. And then 6 years later, and Ebony magazine, if you've seen it, you look at it, it's modeled like after People magazine or Time magazine, but again showing black faces, telling black stories. 6 years later, he launched Jet magazine, a smaller kind of more entertainment format. Over the course of Johnson Publishing Company, he launched a number of other titles of magazines, and I'll share some of the publication names that he launched just because I got a kick out of them. So there was Negro Digest, Ebony, Ebony Jr., Tan Confessions was a magazine that he ran from 1950 to 1952. It was eventually renamed Tan and then renamed Black Stars. He had a magazine called Hue. He had a magazine called Copper Romance, Ebony Man, E-Style, Ebony South Africa. So a number of publications over the life of Johnson Publishing Company. I've got here, this is an image. I'm sorry, there's a delay. So this is an image, something interesting. He owned the first black-owned skyscraper in downtown Chicago. And actually at the time that he bought this building, there were still racial covenants restricting ownership of real estate. So he actually had to get one of his white buddies to go out to the seller and convince the seller to sell the building where he would build his company, because as an African-American man, he couldn't own real estate here. So this is an image of the first headquarters. This is him in his office and his view of the lake. Some images of the lounge and the entryway, kind of at the time, right, a very kind of stylish, forward environment. I give this, again, sorry about the slides, there's a delay, and so I'm jumping the gun. I've given this talk a couple of times and to different audiences, to mixed audiences, and I tend to, spend a lot of time trying to help folks really understand the significance of Ebony magazine, which I don't need to spend that time with this group. But this was, as we know, this was the first time that Black folks got to see ourselves, got to see our faces, got to read our stories in any type of media. And I think it's really impossible to understate two things, right? One is just the validation, and I think kind of the pride that Black people had around having this national magazine that each month would come and they could kind of read about their folks. But then the other thing, I think it's hard to understate the importance that Ebony magazine played in terms of introducing African Americans, frankly, to the rest of America. Over the next 8 decades, from when Ebony and Jet were founded, over the next 8 decades, not only did the magazines tell our stories, but the photographers that the magazines hired captured some of the most iconic moments in African American history, which let's face it, right, is American history. So from the civil rights movement to kind of the rise of African American artists and athletes, politicians, major marches, set-ins, like the photographic archive really documents what was happening in the country throughout these decades. And taken, I want to mention, but it wasn't, what was exciting, right, is it's not just a magazine highlighting political leaders, civil rights leaders, entertainers, athletes. One of my favorite, I remember growing up, spent a bunch of time at my grandmother's house. She actually did not have a subscription to Ebony, but she worked with a woman who did. And so the deal was like once the woman had kind of read the magazine, she would give it to my grandmother to bring home. And I remember, seeing the celebrities, seeing the athletes, seeing like the great civil rights leaders. But like 3 pages in of every magazine was this section, and it's called Speaking of People. And this was just, 2 or 3 sentences of Black professionals, right? You got somebody who's an operations manager at a publishing firm. You've got somebody who's a professional recruiter, some brother who works at the Indiana airport. And, look, if you lived in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, LA, you probably knew and had access to Black professionals. But for the majority of Black people living in the country, this is where they saw what our folks were doing and achieving and capable of. So I think the magazine, played an important role for that as well. And then this is just kind of, Nayand, I'm gonna pause just a second because I'm getting a note that there's some folks in the waiting room, so I'm assuming those folks will be let in. But again, just to give kind of a sense of what the magazines kind of did and what they became over the decades. So going into coming out of the 90s, the magazine started facing financial pressure. And it was obviously, all, old school media, all analog media was facing challenges from digital media, the rise of the internet, moving content online, all of that. So that was a headwind that Ebony and Jet magazine were not spared. But there was something else that was going on, and something that had been building and really hit, crescendo around probably the 1990s, that also created, substantial financial issues for Johnson Publishing Company in publishing these magazines. And that is this.
Oh, shit.
Probably for the first 6 or 7 decades that Johnson Publishing Company published magazines, it was the only source. It was the only media vehicle that was telling Black stories, showing Black faces. Fast forward 1990s, fast forward 2000s, the cover of every major magazine has got our folks on it and is telling our stories. And, it reminds me a lot of, I think about, one thing I think about when I think about this is think about the Negro baseball leagues. You had Jackie Robinson integrate Major League Baseball, which from a kind of social perspective, from a human perspective, democratic perspective, civil rights perspective, imperative, right? So important. But what we remember though is like when there was segregated baseball, you had Black-owned baseball teams in the Negro baseball leagues. You had Black-owned stadiums. You had Black-owned concessions, like the folks kind of making the jerseys and the uniforms. Those were Black-owned businesses. And as important and essential as it is and was that Robinson broke the color barrier and integrated Major League Baseball, it also, right, was a step in the decline of the Negro baseball leagues. And I think in that same way, we saw this kind of inability, which is a good thing from a social and democratic perspective, the inability of Johnson Publishing Company to hold on to kind of its niche in the market really started to put pressure on the magazine. So as a result, in 2019, Johnson Publishing Company filed for bankruptcy. Its debts exceeded its assets, and at this time, there were basically kind of three assets that the company had. You had the magazines, right, which is intellectual property, kind of articles, that stuff. The magazine properties, Ebony and Jet, had actually been sold off to a private equity company around 2017. So then you had two assets left. You had a cosmetics company. This is something I should have mentioned earlier when we were talking about Johnson. Just to give it an example of what a brilliant businessman this guy was. So early on, he's publishing these magazines. Magazines have two sources of revenue. You get subscriptions, and then you sell advertisements in the magazines. And early on, he was having some problems selling ads. I think, mainstream advertisers were worried, like, I don't know if Black folks are going to, buy our products, so we're not going to spend a lot of money on these ads. So what Johnson did, like business genius, entrepreneur, what he did is he started his own cosmetics company called Fashion Fair. And he used the kind of excess advertising inventory of the magazines to advertise stuff of his other company, right? An early example of like vertical integration. So he started this company. And in fact, I talk to my grandmother now and my aunts, and, they know Fashion Fair lotion, Fashion Fair cosmetics. So at the time in 2019, when Johnson Publishing Company was filing bankruptcy, the Ebony and Jet titles, the magazines, had been sold off. You had the cosmetics line, Fashion Fair, and then the other asset that you had was the photography archive. And let me talk a second about the photography archive. I mentioned that really over 8-9 decades, the publishing company hired photographers, freelance, full-time, and they captured these images. So over that time, they had amassed just about 4.5 million images. And so these were contact sheets, slides, prints, negatives. Of the 4.5 million images, only about 1 million of those have really ever been seen by the public, right? Because the majority of the images were pictures or negatives that never ran. And around the time that this was happening, there was a lot of speculation about what would happen to these photographs, what would happen to these 4.5 million photographs, which really, like, as far as I'm concerned, are, priceless documentation of our experience in this country over the past 8-9 decades. So, you had a number of articles kind of being published talking about, what's gonna happen to the photography archive. When I got involved, I'll tell you, I had heard a couple of things. I don't know what was true, what was rumor. One thing I had heard was actually that like a group of white supremacists were raising money to try to buy the photography archive at auction, and they were going to have the photographs destroyed. Not sure if I believe that. I think, what I kind of believed was there would be a private equity group who would, bid on the photos, kind of go through it, grab the 20,000 or so most iconic that they could use to sell tennis shoes and soda and electronic devices, and then who knows what would happen to the rest. I had mentioned earlier that Johnson started his business by borrowing $500, and that was secured by a lien against some furniture that his mom had. At this point, around 2019, Johnson Publishing Company had actually borrowed money and that loan was secured by the photography archive. So if the loan wasn't repaid, the lender would have the right to the photography archive. The lender was none other than this handsome couple, George Lucas and Melody Hobson. They are building this amazing museum right next to USC at Exposition Park. And so, a lot of time the thought was, well, if they just foreclose on the archive, if nobody, bids on it, they will maybe show some of the magazines and the photography archive here at their new museum. So that's the background, and that's where we are. And so I'm going to tell you now how I get involved in the story. So fast forward to summer 2019, and it's a Saturday, and I get an email from one of my litigation partners who does a lot of litigation work for the J. Paul Getty Trust. And this is the actual email he sent me. And it basically says, hey, I was talking to the general counsel of the Getty. They've been following that the Johnson Publishing Company photography archive, which has all the photographs from Ebony and Jet magazines and the other magazines. They're going to be sold at a bankruptcy auction, and the Getty is interested in potentially acquiring it. Do you guys have time to hop on the phone with the GC? So that's the email. We hop on the phone. First, the three of us internally hop on the phone. Then the next day we have a call with the GC. He explains that they've sent some folks out who've done diligence on the archive, and the photographs are in impeccable condition and they've been well preserved, and they're very interested in participating in the auction, but they don't know exactly how to do that. So can we help them? My bankruptcy partner, we find the bankruptcy filing. We reach out to the trustee who's running the bankruptcy auction, and she calls back on a Sunday, and he says, look, I represent the J. Paul Getty Trust, which, as many of you know, is actually the world's largest cultural arts and culture institution. It's got about an $8 billion endowment. I represent the J. Paul Getty Trust. The Getty is interested in participating in the auction. We understand that we may be a little bit behind in the process, but we'd like to qualify to be a bidder and get some time to do our diligence and get up to speed. And so what we'd like to ask, that the auction was scheduled to resume on Monday, so the next day. We're going to need a couple weeks to get up to speed. So we'd like to see if you can postpone the auction for a couple of weeks. And the trustee said, that's fantastic that the Getty is interested. We're happy to postpone the auction to give them time to get up to speed. We can postpone it until Wednesday. Because if the auction doesn't close and if the archive's not sold by the end of the week, the creditor has the right to foreclose on the photography archives. So we immediately huddled the team and we made a list of all the stuff that we had to do, right? To get admitted, conduct diligence, negotiate the purchase agreement, negotiate a co-purchaser agreement, which I'll talk about. We had to develop our bidding strategy. We had to prevail in the auction. We had to negotiate with any claimants who had an interest in the archives. We had to finalize a sale order, go to the hearing, finalize the conveyance document, and then close. And as I mentioned, we literally had 3 days to do all this. So our team immediately got to work. And I want to just with this group, I want to just share. So at this point, we realize it's incredibly demanding time constraints. We've got my bankruptcy partner involved, and I'm involved, and we realized we should get some of our corporate transactional folks. But in the meantime, kind of while we're building out the team, given the timing, I would, begin the diligence and really kind of pull the asset purchase agreement and start to review that and negotiate it and mark it up for our client. What I didn't realize was that, 24 hours in, what I realized kind of 24 hours in, I had in the back of my mind, okay, I'm just kind of leading this now and starting the diligence and negotiating the agreement and working with the client and interfacing with the trustee. But pretty soon we're going to have our full team on board and we'll be able to attack this thing. I think 24 hours in, I realized I'm actually the full team here. and I'm leading the team. And there's other folks, at my firm who are dropping everything to help. But at this point, this is my deal. And if it doesn't get done, it's because I screwed something up. And so that was, just candidly, like very, very terrifying. So I've got a couple of slides. I won't bore folks with this, but I've just got a couple of slides that give a nature of the types of issues that came up. So in terms of the transaction, obviously, to some extent, you approach this like you would like a traditional corporate transaction. You've got, your diligence. You've got to think about what types of protections you build into the agreement. I do a lot of my work in real estate, and so this next item is not as much of an issue. But here, I was very focused on possession of the assets. For our client, given the nature of who the client was, my number one concern throughout the entire process was just certainty of execution. We had one shot to do this. The shot would not kind of resurface. We want to get a second bite of the apple, and so we had to win the auction and we had to close. And then obviously a bunch of coordination. So this is, kind of broad transactional considerations. And then what was demanding and exciting were, just the various kind of, legal issues and the different legal disciplines that this dealt with. We talked about the diligence. At its core, this was an intellectual property deal, buying these photographs. Because it was in the bankruptcy context, you also had to deal with other claimants who purported to have an interest in the assets of the company. There were tax considerations, and then there was also a co-purchaser consideration. And I'll pause now to kind of mention this. And I said that we were contacted by the J. Paul Getty Trust. Immediately, went to work working on the deal. On Monday, we got a call from the Getty, and they said, good news. We've been in touch with some other foundations who, like us, think that this is a monumental and once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And these other foundations want to be involved, and they want to come in with us, and they want to bid with us and be co-purchasers together. So that's fantastic. And this is a group of foundations. I got a slide on them at the end, but it was, the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, like the largest philanthropic organizations in the country historically. So that's fantastic from a support perspective. What it also meant is with now just 48 hours, we also had to negotiate basically a partnership agreement among these foundations that, let's face it, are used to kind of doing stuff by themselves and on their own terms. Again, won't go through this detail, but just getting at some of, when you drill down into some of the intellectual property issues, they were complex and nuanced. So really had to get our arms around this. Had my bankruptcy partner who was really my co-pilot and helping me navigate the bankruptcy process, forming this partnership among the four co-purchasers. We had, issues related to taking title and liability and decision-making and responsibility. So these were all of the issues that we were having to work through on really a real-time basis. And again, in an environment where, failure of execution was not an option. So we get to Wednesday, we're in Chicago. It's the day of the auction. This is actually not what the auction looked like. We were just in a law firm conference room. And this was the winning bid. And this is a bid that I wrote. This is my penmanship. It's signed by my client, but this was the bid. Our client's bid a total of $30 million to acquire the photography archive out of bankruptcy. We went 2 days later. Once we won the auction, we had a day. First thing I did was I went out to do a visual inspection of the archive, and I've got some neat things to share about that with you in a couple of minutes. But there was still a lot of work to do. Even once we won the auction, we had to finalize the conveyance documents. We had to settle stuff with the other claimants, and then prepare for the final bankruptcy hearing on Friday, where the court and the judge confirmed the sale. So that was how the transaction ended. I want to in the last few minutes, I want to do a couple of things. I want to say a little bit about my clients here, because I think it helps put in perspective the significance of the transaction. So we represented the J. Paul Getty Trust. The J. Paul Getty Trust, its mission talks about inspiring human understanding through visual art and cultural heritage. The Getty is dedicated to the conservation of the world's artistic legacy. What the Getty is known for is, buying and collecting and preserving in perpetuity 2,000-year-old bronze statues, right? These manuscripts, which are millennial old. These are priceless artifacts that really, are testament and testimony to the human experience. And the fact that the Getty, who's dedicated to this type of preservation, kind of the fact that they looked at these 4.5 million photographs and they said that has the same cultural value and that has the same kind of invaluable essence as this statue that will never exist. To me, that was very significant. And then I mentioned who the co-purchasers were. It's this group of foundations. These groups, Ford Foundation, MacArthur, Mellon, also the Smithsonian came in and is now a co-purchaser. These groups had never collaborated to do anything like this before, and it took 4.5 million photographs of Black folks to bring these groups together to say this is something worth us doing together. So I think that really struck me. The next and the last thing I want to do before we open it up just for a couple of questions is I want to show you some of the images that I got to see when I went to go visit the archive. So like I mentioned, as soon as we won the auction, I called an Uber, and you see the woman in this picture. That's actually the bankruptcy trustee. She and I hopped in an Uber, and we went out to this building. Brick 6-story building. It's about 25 minutes outside of downtown Chicago. Kind of really not a neighborhood that you'd be interested in spending a ton of time in. But this is the building where the photo archive was housed. We go up, you sign in, you go up to the 6th floor, and this is what you see. It's a huge room, and it's filled with these bookshelves. And on these bookshelves, you've got these bankers boxes. The first thing I noticed, was like, boy, those fire sprinklers are awfully close to the top of the boxes. So the first thing we did is we had somebody go out and get plastic tarps from Home Depot to come and cover anything in case the fire alarm went off. But so you go up, you meet, there's a woman who works in the archives and she keeps it organized. And so you get off the elevator, you meet her, and she asked me, she said, are there any, images of specific individuals that you're interested in seeing? And I said, Jackson 5 for sure. And so she said, we've got a couple of boxes. Let me go grab them. She said, put these white gloves on, but feel free to look around and open the boxes. Just wear these gloves. So I'm looking around and I see, I want to show you like what some of the stuff looks like. You open these boxes and you open the folders, and these are the images that you're met with. And they are completely timeless. Sorry about the glare and the light. I took these actually with my iPhone. But these are the images you see. And what strikes you is not only how the photographers captured the subject, but how they captured like the mood and the attitude and the vibe and the, everything. You can see behind that picture of Aretha Franklin, you could see the slides, right? I was talking about, there's 4.5 million images, some that have never been seen. So a lot of them are on these microfiche slides. I loved this one of Marvin Gaye. It's like probably the smoothest picture I've ever seen of his brother. So Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali. Love this one of James Brown. It was interesting. Shortly after I saw the archive, I went to the Smithsonian Museum in DC, the National Museum of African American Culture and History. And they've got actually this exact outfit that he's wearing. It's in a case that's preserved. So I thought it was great that just a few days before I had seen the picture. And then what's really special about some of the photos, a lot of the photos we've seen, the iconic ones, but what's really special are some of the intimate moments that the photographer captured. So I'm going to share just two photos that I saw of Billie Holiday, and I think this is it's timely because we just watched the movie Billie Holiday versus the United States. But you've got this very kind of intimate photograph of her, sitting in a chair in her hotel room, And what struck me about this picture is when you look closely, I looked at her forearms, and she's got like what looked like, mosquito bites all up and down her forearms. But of course, we know that those aren't mosquito bites; those are heroin tracks. And the fact that that we get this these images kind of captured and preserved. I went while I was waiting for the docent to bring back my Jackson 5 box. I saw on the ground a box that said Malcolm X on it, and my eyes like lit up. I was excited, and so I went over and I grabbed the box, and I opened it up, and it was shocking because the box did not contain photographs of Malcolm X. The first thing I saw was this letter. Mr. Adams was the publisher at the time of the magazine. Mr. Adams, I regret the poor quality of these photos. I took them myself with Tri-X, but had no light meter, so had to guess the lighting on each one. Signed, Malcolm X, in his own hand. What was in this box, this was an entire box of photographs that Malcolm X had taken himself, and they were photographs of Black men who had been beaten, shot, and killed by Chicago police. And I'll give a warning, but some of these, I'm going to share some of the actual photographs. He took these photographs at police headquarters, sometimes in the morgue. You could see here a brother who had been beaten in his head. Here's an image of a brother at the morgue. You could see where the bullet entered his skull, and you could see the stitches from the autopsy. Another photograph of a brother at the morgue after an autopsy. And what Malcolm X did is on the back of each of these photographs, he described who the individual was. So here he says, left to right, Clarence Jingles, age 21, shot through pelvis and hip. Arthur Coleman, age 27, shot through chest, just a quarter inch above the heart, and also shot through penis and stomach. Monroe Jones, age 21, shot through left shoulder, shown with wife and father who have just brought in his clothes. Monroe Jones, 21, shot through left shoulder, beaten and stomped by police, was one of 2 Muslims originally stopped by police and questioned concerning some clothes he was taking from his car. Both worked for the dry cleaners. What struck me immediately about these images were the years that were written on the back. And the years were 1962, 1963, 1964. And the reality that I was overcome with was the reality of how little progress, we had made, really in 50 years in terms of this, in terms of police violence towards Black bodies. And it was very sobering. And I guess, what I'll close with is that my hope, look, it's my hope in the Getty and the Smithsonian and MacArthur and Mellon and Ford acquiring and preserving the photography archive. My hope is that it will be used in a way that continues to show our faces and tell our story in a way that creates an environment where we can get beyond what we've been unable to get beyond for the past 50 years. So